All right, everybody, here we are at the end, our last set of notes for the year. Today we'll be closing out the 1990s, talking a little bit about some other trends from the decade, particularly the growth of the internet and advertising culture during the 1990s, which again pushed limits just like the 90s did in many, many other ways. So um, let's close it down. All right, so advertising in the 19, you got some. I have some products there and things that the got milk ads became really popular during the 90s with different athletes or celebrities that promote drinking milk. This is Cal Ripken Jr., a baseball player. Reebok pumps, part of the shoe culture from the 1990s, were a big deal, especially early in the 90s. High top sneakers for basketball um, were huge at that time, and they had this pump technology that was supposed to make you jump higher and stuff like that, which is all kind of silly, but it sold shoes, so people were into that. I had a pair of pumps in like seventh grade, I think. Um, we also see video games. Video games growing in popularity during this time. Sega Genesis released the first 16-bit video game system. Nintendo came out shortly after that with the Super Nintendo, which was 16-bit, and then in like 1996, Nintendo created Nintendo 64, which was the next evolution in video game technology with um, more like first-person perspective and racing games and um, first shooter games and first-person shooter games or whatever. And then there was also, which early in the 90s, Pepsi kind of had, it wasn't as bad as New Coke, but they had their own kind of campaign of something called Crystal Pepsi, which was basically just clear Pepsi that they tried to market for a while, but it never really caught on all that much. And it was kind of a big oops during the 1990s. It wasn't as bad as the New Coke thing, but still didn't go over all that well. All right. So, we see a lot of the trends in advertising that started during the 1980s continue into the 1990s in terms of using celebrities and athletes to sell products, using sex to sell products and sex appeal and things of that nature, like we saw a little bit during the 80s. But it really hits new heights in the 1990s. This is something I'll get into here in a little bit. Um, we see even more the marketability of athletes during the 1990s. See Cal Ripken up here, and lots of other ones, in particular Michael Jordan. Obviously, in the 1990s, is the most marketable of any athlete from any sport. But we see shoe commercials really are huge during this time, where athletes are starting to get their own signature shoes and things like that, like and obviously Jordans and other players. Charles Barkley had his own shoe. David Robinson had his own shoe. Kobe had his own shoe. Allen Iverson, Deion Sanders, Ken Griffey Jr. So guys in a lot of different sports. The shoe culture is really ramping up here in the 1990s. We also see celebrities of all kinds getting big, big sponsorship deals. Some of the better athletes would get more money off the sponsorships than they would for their athletic contracts. We see actors and actresses that start to make millions of dollars off of sponsoring various products, especially in foreign countries like Japan. Japanese companies would pay celebrities from America millions of dollars to come and sponsor, you know, sponsor their goods or something like Sony in Japan, different car companies. They really paid top dollar for the American celebrities to come over and try to convince people to buy their goods. Again, uh, we also see advertising start to cater to younger folks as well. As Generation X is really taking over in the 1990s in terms of that target audience, advertisers recognize this. Um, you know, um, Pepsi, kind of branded themselves as the choice of a new generation to encourage people to drink Pepsi. Um, Ads became more provocative, or companies would invest more money in trying to sell things to these younger people. For instance, if you're Chevy, or if you're General Motors, maybe you're investing a lot of money into convincing people to buy Cadillacs and Buicks. But by the 1990s, younger people don't want those cars. Those cars are for old people. So they're going to start to remarket the things they have to these Generation Xers, who are now becoming the focal point um, of marketing campaigns. Uh, which means they have different interests, right? And how do you do that when you talk about advertising for a minute? So if I want to cater to a new group of people, I have to change everything I do, right? If I want to sell a car, for instance, and I show images of somebody driving the car, and I want to cater to a younger group of people, I don't necessarily want images of a mom and a dad and a family in the car. I want images of somebody that's young and cool and maybe driving off road and looking like they're having real fun driving. I also want to change the music. Maybe I don't anymore want to influence the music that was popular from the 50s and 60s. Instead of playing Elvis and the Beatles, maybe for this next generation, I want to appeal to younger people, so I'm going to play Michael, or so the background music is going to be something more modern, maybe Michael Jackson or Madonna or something like that. So it's a new generation of people that we're trying to appeal to here in the 1990s, and advertisers do a good job with this. It didn't happen without its fair share of controversy. There was a lot of advertising controversy in the 1990s, usually associated around sex appeal. Calvin Klein got in big trouble because all of his models were really, really skinny, and people thought they were trying to almost essentially glorify uh, eating disorders because some of the models, female models in particular, looked, almost anorexic. Uh, so it was a lot edgier with, the look of things, and advertisers would really try to sell sex and sex appeal for their goods, no matter what the goods were, right? If it was a sexy car, you want a sexy person selling that car. Uh, you would use models, men or male or female, on the beach that appear almost naked, because you want to try to sell some cologne or something of that nature. Uh, Ads for different beers were notorious for this, as they would want to, convince people to buy, if you're a guy and you drink this beer, then you're going to get this hot girl, or, something of that nature, or vice versa. Sex really sold in the 90s, and a lot of the commercials that were popular during that time probably wouldn't go so well nowadays. Okay. So another big thing that happened during, of course, the 90s is the sudden boom of the internet. Uh, I remember, when this happened, because, people my age are kind of the last group of people that remember what life was like without the internet in your home. Um, and, for instance, uh, by the time, when I started high school in like 1994, the internet wasn't even a thing we really knew anything about, and it was limited availability. When you learned how to do keyboarding in high school my freshman year, you're still doing it on like a typewriter, okay, or a word processor, which you probably don't even know what that is. By the time I was a senior, we were doing classes in computer and showing people how to use the internet. So it changed just in that time while I was there. Um, so the internet actually was invented in the 1960s. It was something that doesn't matter, it won't be on the test. It was something called ARPANET, and it was used basically by the government. Uh, and um, but it wasn't really made for commercial use until much later, until the 1990s, or the 1980s or early 1990s, when it became practical for people to be able to use the internet on their own computers. Okay, um, so the big person or the big group behind this, of course, is Microsoft and Bill Gates. It's during, before the 90s, nobody knew who Bill Gates was. By the end of the 90s, he was the richest man on earth. This largely came because of Windows software, in particular Windows 95. This is what really introduced the internet for a lot of people in America, made it very accessible, to be able to have browsers and things on your computer that made it easy to navigate around enough that the average person from the ages of, 5-year-old kids to 85-year-old grandmothers could utilize and benefit from what the internet had to offer. Okay, uh, they went on a media blitz and commercial blitz talking about Windows 95 and what it was going to do for everyone. Now, of course, this was released in 1995. I want to say around April, but that could be totally off. It doesn't matter. Um, and it was one of these things that everybody had to get. Now, people were still getting computers at this time. I mean, my mom was a secretary. She worked in an office, but we didn't actually have computers at home. We didn't have a computer at our house, which is hard to imagine today. Um, but like I remember in high school, if I had to do a 10-page paper or a big paper or something like that, I'd hand write the whole thing, and then my mom would take it to school to type it for me because that was just the most practical way to do it. Uh, but by the end of the decade, pretty much everybody's got a computer, okay, and that's a big deal. Uh, Microsoft becomes such a big company that by the end of the decade, they're embroiled in an antitrust lawsuit, meaning that people considered Microsoft to be a monopoly, which of course monopolies are illegal. Okay, uh, essentially they were kind of a monopoly, but they weren't forced to break up. They just had to pay a massive fine of like millions of dollars, which really was nothing to Microsoft, and that was that. And that's kind of what happened with the antitrust lawsuit. But Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer, the other guy at Microsoft, got in big trouble, because of this. Of course, the internet comes from something called the World Wide Web, which is essentially a available database of information that people are able to access. This is what www means when you type in a certain email addresses or certain website addresses. It was invented, and the name and the concept was come by a British guy by the name of Tim Berners-Lee, who kind of developed the whole concept of the World Wide Web and what it could do for people. But it was still a new concept that a lot of people didn't really understand. Okay, uh, it's not really until, in particular, companies like Yahoo and Google come around that people really, and this is about 97, 98, when Yahoo, Google, and other ones uh, come around and make it much easier for people to search the internet trying to find information. Okay, um, but we become more and more dependent on computers as the decade goes on. My freshman year at UD was the last year. It was the last year in which computers were not provided to all incoming freshmen. I actually didn't have a computer in college until my own computer in college until like my junior year. So whenever I had to type something, I just used somebody else's computer early on. And obviously today we wouldn't be able to get by doing that. But having in college is a very transitional period as we're becoming more and more dependent upon and used to using computer sources. eBay, of course, is a kind of a precursor to Amazon in terms of buying and selling and auctioning off goods on the internet. People are trying all kinds of different ideas to turn into successful internet companies, and it's a huge, huge boom late in the decade. Amazon was founded, I think, 1996 or 7. Originally, all Amazon was an online way for people to buy and sell books. You could sell your old books on Amazon. You could buy new ones. Obviously, it worked out well with the books, and they transitioned into other goods and services as well. And now, of course, it's a monstrosity. At the end of the decade, everybody's really, really worried because of the Y2K scare. Everybody thought that computers at midnight on January 1st, 2000, we're all going to crash. And because the computer wouldn't know what year to make it. And everybody was afraid that computers would revert back to thinking it was the year 1900. And therefore, everything that had been done on computers after that point, which literally is everything that's ever been done on computers, would somehow get wiped out. So people's computers, bank accounts, documents, files, everything, because it's all dated and made essentially after it was made after, before a date that had even happened yet. Everybody's going to lose everything. You probably don't understand that. Again, what I'm saying is like, so the computer is going to go from thinking it's December 31st, 1999 to being January 1st, 1900, which means everything's wiped out because we don't get computers really to the 70s and 80s at the earliest. And if the computer thinks it's 1900, suddenly a document that was created in 1987 will somehow not be valid, and everything will get wiped out. Now, it turned out to be way overblown, and nothing happened. It just the computer figured it out, and it became 2000, and everything was fine. But people were really, really consumed and fearful that there's going to be some sort of Armageddon as a result of Y2K. Now, there's tons and tons of companies that are created as a result of what we call the internet bubble. Companies were pulling up people like crazy. I remember in college, my first few years, everybody I knew was graduating was getting a job like that. And a lot of them were getting jobs with various internet-based companies because there were so many of them. But eventually that bubble became so large because, again, supply and demand, there's too many companies that eventually there's just too many and it's going to burst. And essentially that's what happens. In early 2001, the internet bubble finally bursts and we go into an economic downturn, and then it gets worse because of the September 11th attacks. A lot of people start losing their jobs, and the internet bubble here kind of bursts all of a sudden early here in the 2000s. So some other big trends of the 1990s, at least as I remember them. Obviously later in the decade we had the emergence of Nintendo 64 and legendary games like 007, GoldenEye, and Mario Kart and things of that nature. This is a huge step forward in video game capability in terms of the presentation of the game and form was a big deal. So that's big. We see grunge fashion and culture become really, really popular early in the 1990s. Not a whole lot of fashion stuff really blows your mind in the 1990s that's really definable. After the first half of the decade, where everybody's wearing kind of lots of denim and flannel and baggy clothes, the second half of the decade takes a much more moderate form in clothing. And it resembles more a lot of the sort of things that you see people wearing today. We see video games, like I mentioned before, continue to grow in popularity as people have more and more systems. Everybody hangs on to their old Nintendos. They replace, then they get the next one, Super Nintendo, whatever. Then they get the Nintendo 64. So now you get all these gaming systems. I know like some of my friends that had a lot of younger siblings would have like 4 different systems in their house that everybody would want to play all the time. And the younger brother likes the 64, the older brother likes the original Nintendo, and that was just the 90s. We also see kind of a reemergence in popularity of professional wrestling late in the decade. It was generally referred to as a primetime male soap opera, and it was the 90s that gave rise to probably the 2 biggest stars ever in this industry, which are The Rock, or Dwayne Johnson, and Steve Austin, Stone Cold Steve Austin, who were the 2 biggest stars probably in the history of wrestling. And this was, I never, ever watched wrestling as a kid. And then I went off to college freshman year, and that was kind of at the height of the WWF or WWE, and everybody was watching it. It was like the it was like the show that everybody would watch if you call appointment television. Everybody in the dorm, we'd go down um, you go into somebody's room and everybody would watch the Monday Night Raw, and then afterwards we'd go in the hallways and everybody would be wrestling around and stuff like that. Uh, it was pretty crazy and extremely popular during this time. Sellout crowds at stadiums. You can see the shirts all over the place with people wearing that sort of thing. And of course, ultimately, it makes a huge worldwide megastar out of Dwayne Johnson. So that speaks to largely the popularity of this at the time. I kind of already talked about this as well. The shoe culture in the 1990s hits big, big heights as more and more athletes get their own shoes. New shoes come out every year, for different players. And, it really mattered the shoes that you had. You had to get a new one every few months or whatever to just stay up with the times and everything. And, it was a big deal to have like the latest shoes. Everybody make a big deal about that sort of thing. In terms of literature in the 1990s, John Grisham was pretty much the biggest name in literature from this time. He wrote many legal novels during the 1990s and made him an incredibly big time author. He still writes today. And many of his films, pretty much every movie he made or every book he writes, eventually becomes a movie. But some of the biggest legal movies um, of the 1990s were based off John Grisham novels. A Time to Kill, The Pelican Brief, The Firm, books like that. So, and they were big, big movies, and it kind of rejuvenated interest for people in legal thrillers and stuff. So that's all, folks. That's the end of your notes for this year. Hopefully, you have a chance to look over this and help you be ready for Wednesday's test. Hey, it's been good, not the way we wanted to do it at the end of the day, but hope you enjoyed.